Shalom. This week in the land of Israel, we are reading two Torah portions, Tazria and Metzora, beginning in Leviticus chapter 12 and all the way through Leviticus chapter 15. And these two Torah portions, really where we are now journeying into the hearts of the Torah, the heart of the book of Leviticus, and we're dealing now with laws that are difficult for us to understand. They seem to be from a bygone era. People say, well, these laws really don't apply anymore. And they're laws that deal with contamination, purification, laws of impurity and purity. And the majority of these laws in these two Torah portions deal with an ailment known as tsarat, which is sometimes translated as leprosy, but it's really not the classic physical leprosy that was known in the world. This is a spiritual ailment that is diagnosed not by a doctor, but by the Kohen, who gives a very special prescription of how to deal with this affliction, this ailment that is actually heaven-sent. And the other laws that we're dealing with in these parshiot, in these Torah portions, have to deal with discharges of the body, males and females, childbirth. All these laws, people have a tendency to look at these things in a very judgmental way, and it just adds fuel to the fire of misunderstanding about the whole, what's called the cult of life at the time of the Holy Temple. And there's a lot of misunderstanding, criticism that I want to really relate to people who have such a hard time and almost feel it necessary to apologize for the Torah because they think that these things are like the vestige, like the remnant of some very primitive past that this nomadic, primitive tribe, the Jewish people, used to subscribe to. But now, of course, we are liberated, emancipated, enlightened. We're part of the modern world. We have iPads. And so what place do we have in our life for these rules of purification and contamination that seem to actually be so oppressive and restrictive? And they seem to be saddled upon a person arbitrarily, and they seem to castigate and isolate and alienate a person from society, and they seem to be bespeaking some sort of very backwards and primitive feeling of contamination. All this mentality that we are alluding to now, which is so often heard in the halls of the modernists, of those who look upon the Torah with apologetics and look upon it askance, and those people who are uncomfortable with their own Judaism, they look upon these things from the space of their own limited intellect and their own immature spirituality and their own uncomfortability with all things holy and their own disconnect from the sacred. And they say, what's this all about? It has no place in our world. But we, in our modern iPad generation, are so backwards. We are so disadvantaged. And what we've accomplished with technology is only an indictment of our total lack in spiritual understanding of the true nature of the universe, so that we need all of these crutches, toys, and devices to somehow validate our empty existences, because we are so far from the spiritual underpinnings of who we could be as real human beings. So, what are these two Torah portions really all about? The emphasis of these laws of purity and impurity, laws associated with conditions of the body, males, females, relationships, and this mysterious core subject, tsarat, a disease unlike any other never visited upon any nation in the world in history other than Israel a spiritual indicator of one's closeness to God and one's level of righteousness and actually one's level of sensitivity. So bear with me momentarily as we twist our heads completely around to a different position, and we have some sort of snap that can bring us into an altered level of consciousness and cleanse us a little bit from our preconceived notions and allow us to look at these Torah portions differently as follows. These rules, Hashem's guidelines for us to live a life of elevation, have nothing to do with any sort of physical malady, ailment, a state of uncleanness, as we would call it, or some sort of being soiled. These rules bespeak the aspiration to a much higher level of sensitivity than you or I would ever dream of. They are the gentle machinery to pull us into a level of understanding in our daily life, in our relationships with each other and with the divine, to understand that we could be living on such a heightened level of awareness and sensitivity, and this, unfortunately, is so far from us today. That's why we don't live according to these rules. But in the world that Hashem designed, which we aspire to, and in the time of the Holy Temple, these laws, they're not about being physically impure like some tribal taboo that people want to say this is about some sort of belief that ancient people had that associates discharges from the body with impurity, and it's all very backwards, and the whole thing of tzaraat. No, this is something else entirely. This is an idea that actually to be on the heightened level of perception and awareness and sensitivity that we were designed to live on, our everyday life would be catapulted to a level of such keen perception and awareness and sensitivity that every moment of our lives would be completely different. For example, the whole subject of tzaraat, of this spiritual leprosy, our sages teach us how it was visited upon a person, with some exceptions, but there's a general rule. It was visited upon a person who himself had been insensitive to others, who himself had alienated himself from the community and had chosen to look down upon others. It's known that this disease was divine retribution for talebearing, for evil speech, for gossip against others. And this person had to go through a certain sense of isolation in order to realign himself with the community. It was a result of his own insensitivity. And furthermore, the verse that tells us that the leper, and again we're using that word only for lack of a better translation, he would have to call out to others who would approach him. He would have to call out the words, tameh, tameh, I am impure. Some people look at this and say the Torah is being so cruel. He's already down. Why do we have to add insult to injury, that God requires this person to make an announcement and to distance others from him, and for him to himself declare himself to be such a social outcast, to warn others, don't approach me, don't look upon me, I am impure. And the sages teach us the reason why he is required to call out is to arouse the mercy in others to pray for him collectively, because the prayer of the community focused and concentrated on one individual is so powerful that they will be able to bring him back to a state of rectification. This is all part of a vast program of rehabilitation, of spiritual sensitivity. The other form of tzaraat that we study about in these Torah portions, the tzarat that affected one's clothing, the tzarat that affected the walls of one's home, which was also the indicator of a treasure that God had for this person. There's so much more here than meets the eye. This is a whole world of delicate spiritual fibers that connect all of us together in the world that God created with the Creator Himself, that call us to this level of awareness, to see things differently. The tumah, again, a very bad translation, the impurity, which is actually an altered spiritual state that is associated with childbirth, is also a question of sensitivity, because the whole cycle of renewal, the cycle of bringing new life into the world, and then the cycle of a husband and wife being separated for a period of time and then coming back together, is an exercise, the greatest exercise, in heightened sensitivity, in the beauty and the perfection of the relationship between husband and wife, and it serves to add to their appreciation of each other, and to add to their perpetual love and the renewal of their attraction in each other. So the whole basis of all of these laws, as opposed to this very misguided and unfortunate misconception that so many have, that this is part of an ancient system that doesn't apply to us today, actually the opposite is true. Actually, we are so far removed from the life that God intended for us that when we look upon these things, we don't understand, and we try to fit it in to our contemporary modern mindset, which is in itself so empty of value, and so warped, and so isolationist, and so totally self-centered, that we don't realize that what Hashem is doing here is He's calling us to such a greater level of knowledge and comprehension and participation in the pageantry of the human experience. And this is just an indicator of the life that God really has in store for us, where every moment, and this is really what these laws are all about in Tazria-Metzora, the laws of purity, they're about how every aspect of our relationships and every moment that we breathe and every moment of our lives could and should and really must be imbued with a much higher level of identity, of connection, of perception, and most of all, of sensitivity. And really the Torah is calling us here through these laws to an expectation that is so high, a goal, very, very lofty, of being so totally sensitive to the nuance of every moment, to the nuance of every relationship between individuals, between husband and wife, between members of a community. The Torah has a very high expectation for us to reach that level of sensitivity. And of course, in our modern age, where we have such great emancipation, such knowledge, and such keen emphasis on the rights of the individual with our iPhone, iPad, etc., everything is totally distanced and disconnected from this vision of a holistic, universal, wholesome unity of souls, which is what the community of Israel is designed to be. And the more that we study in the Torah this idea of how we are being encouraged through every mitzvah, and how we are gently being led to a place of much more heightened awareness and sensitivity, the more we begin to understand how insensitive to each other we really are. And just what is the extent that the Torah ennobles and enshrines as a goal of the type of sensitivity which we really need to display. Very moving and beautiful example is cited in Tractate Ta'anit of the Talmud regarding one of the great tzaddikim, one of the great righteous men, who's called Nachum Ish Gamzu. His name was Nachum, the man of Gamzu. And Gamzu is not a place, it's actually a contraction of two words. He was known as the man of Gamzu because Gamzu means also this. And he was habitually quoted as saying about any incident and anything that ever happened, Gamzu l'tova. This is also for the good. He would always ascribe God's providence onto anything, so that even if something happened that appeared to be very, very negative or appeared to be very bad, he always said, Gamzu l'tova. This is also for the ultimate good, even though we can't see it. This was his major attribute by which he was known. So the Talmud talks about this man, Nachum Ish Gamzu, that later in life he was blind in both his eyes, his hands were crippled, also his two legs were crippled, and his entire body was covered with terrible boils. So he suffered greatly, and he was living in a very dilapidated home that was about to collapse. And at one point it looked like his home was really about to collapse, as also the legs of his bed were placed in buckets of water so that ants would not crawl up and torment what was little left of his body. The house was about to collapse, and his students said, "We had better remove your bed from this house, and afterwards we'll come back and take out all the furniture and all the vessels." And he said to them, "My children, first take out everything else from the house, and afterwards come back and take out my bed, because I'm sure that as long as I'm lying in the house will not fall." Meaning he was so confident of his righteousness that God would protect him and that the house would not collapse as long as he was there. So indeed, they turned everything out of the house, and afterwards they came back and removed his bed from the house. And they said to him, they said, "Our master, if this is the case, that you are such a perfect, righteous man, that you knew that your merit would protect you and the house would not fall, then how is it that you have come to this point?" Meaning we see that you are suffering so greatly, that your body has been visited by such terrible retribution. So how did this happen exactly? And he said to them, he said, "My children, I actually brought this upon myself. I caused it. Because one time," he told them the story, "one time I was traveling and I was going to visit my father-in-law, and I had with me 3 donkeys, 3 beasts of burden that were laden down with food and drink and every kind of good thing. I was going along the road, and suddenly a pauper stood in front of me in the road. A poor person came and stood before me and said to me, 'Master, please give me to eat. Give me food.' And I said, 'Just wait one moment until I get down from the donkey and open up one of the bundles and gladly take something out.' But I did not suffice to unpack from the bundle quickly enough until the person expired before me." That's how hungry this person was, and I didn't realize that he was really on the threshold of death. So I went and fell upon his face, and I said, "My eyes that had no mercy on your eyes, may they become blind. My hands that did not care about your hands, may they be cut off. And my legs that did not move fast enough to you, may they be crippled. And I was not satisfied until I said, and may all my entire body be covered with boils." His students said to him, "Rabbi, woe to us that we see you in this condition." And he said to them, "Woe to me if you would have not seen me in this condition." This is such an amazing story, because he was such a righteous man, and he obviously was moved so greatly for this person that he moved as quickly as he could, but yet he was not satisfied with himself, and this was not a punishment that was commensurate to his sin at all. But yet he asked to be punished. He asked that this should be brought upon him because he was so critical of his own self that he felt that he could not go through the rest of his life without paying for what he considered to be his insensitivity. And how much more so does this apply to the average person? Here we have a great man, one of the great men of Israel, whose whole life was about dedication, self-sacrifice, and diligence, and holiness, and caring about someone else. And yet he wasn't satisfied that at the moment of truth, he felt he could have moved faster, he could have done something more for this person. And I think that the Torah holds this up as an example of a level of sensitivity to aspire to, which is not really even accessible to the majority of humanity, but yet it's enshrined as an example of the extent to which a person should want to go, is really required to go, must go for another human being. And this is the backbone and basis of the entire Torah, to be sensitive to another person. And so too, in our widely misunderstood, but yet central, important, significant Torah portions of this week, Tazria-Metzora, where we encounter these rules of purity, the basis of this entire system and this godly program of spiritual balance is designed to lead us to a greater level of sensitivity, to a higher level of perception, so that we can appreciate the finest nuance of every moment of our lives and our relationships with each other, as well as our relationship with God.